I don't think anyone sets out to become the black sheep of their family. It's not like I woke up one day and thought, you know what would be fun? Being the one everyone laughs at, dismisses, and leaves out. No, it's something that just happens. Quietly, slowly. And before you realize it, you're living in that role, whether you wanted it or not. Growing up, I always felt like I was standing just a step outside of the circle. My siblings would sit around the dinner table, trading stories that made my parents beam with pride, top grades, sports trophies, shiny certificates. And then there was me, the one who maybe got a B instead of an A, the one who wasn't the fastest on the field, the one who drew messy sketches on the corner of my notebook instead of doing math problems that I still remember one night. I must have been around 10, we were all eating spaghetti. My brother was talking about winning some school competition, and my mom clapped like he'd just won the Nobel Prize. Then my dad turned to me and asked, "And what about you? Did you do anything special today?" I froze. My special thing had been that I finally figured out how to whistle properly. But when I proudly demonstrated, the whole table burst out laughing. Not the warm, gentle kind of laugh. No, the kind that stings. My dad shook his head and muttered, "Always the odd one out." That phrase stuck. Odd one out. Black sheep.it. Wasn't just one night. It was constant, in tiny ways. Birthdays where my presence felt like an afterthought. School plays where my parents clapped politely for me, but erupted when it was my sister's turn. Even family photos. I noticed later how I was always shoved slightly to the side, half cut out of the frame, like an accident. It sounds small, doesn't it? But those small things pile up until you're buried under them. Inside, I kept asking myself, what's wrong with me? Why can't I be the one they're proud of? I tried to change, studied harder, mimicked my siblings, even laughed at jokes I didn't find funny just to fit in. But no matter how much I twisted myself, it never seemed enough. And when you're a kid, that kind of rejection doesn't just hurt. It shapes you. It whispers to you, you don't belong here. You're not one of them. Sometimes I'd escape to my room after dinner, lying on my bed staring at the ceiling. I'd imagine what it would feel like if, just once, my parents walked in and said, "We're proud of you." Just once. I can still picture the glow of the old lamp on my desk, the way the shadows stretched across the wall, and me, clutching a pillow, silently begging for the kind of love that never came. And the thing about being the black sheep? Eventually, you stop trying. You start to lean into it. If they're going to mock you anyway, you might as well play the part. So I became sarcastic, distant, the quiet kid who laughed at his own jokes. It was easier than setting myself up for disappointment again and again, but deep down, it still hurt. No matter how much armor I put on, I couldn't escape the feeling that I was always on the outside looking in. If being the black sheep as a kid felt like carrying a quiet bruise, then growing up with dreams was like pressing on it, over and over again. You'd think maybe, as I got older, my family would start taking me seriously. But no. If anything, the jokes just got sharper. I remember being 16, sitting in the living room with my sketchbook balanced on my knees. I had been working on designs for weeks, teaching myself shading, perspective, all the things I could never quite get right in school. And for the first time, I thought, maybe this is something I could do. Maybe this is where I'm meant to shine. So, I said it out loud. I told them I wanted to be an artist. The silence was immediate, followed by the kind of laughter that burns itself into your memory. My brother slapped his knee, my sister rolled her eyes, and my mom muttered something. Like, that's not a real career. My dad didn't even bother laughing. He just gave me that disappointed sigh and said, "Dreams are fine, but when are you going to get serious?" That line, "get serious," as if the one thing that lit me up inside was nothing more than a silly distraction. I remember closing the sketchbook slowly, like I was hiding a crime. Inside, I was screaming, "Why can't you just believe in me, even for a second?" But outside, I just smiled and made a joke about being a starving artist. It was easier to join in on the mockery than let them see how much it cut me. And it wasn't just art. Every idea I had was met with the same ridicule. The time I said I wanted to travel, my aunt laughed and asked, "With what money?" When I talked about starting a small business, my cousin leaned back in his chair and said, "Oh great, another failure waiting to happen." I can still hear his smug tone, like he already knew my story would be nothing but mistakes. You know what's cruel? When the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who plant seeds of doubt in your head. After a while, I didn't even need them to mock me. I started doing it myself. Every new dream I had, I'd shoot it down before I even spoke it. Don't bother, they'll laugh. Don't bother, you'll fail. Don't bother, because you're you. But even though I buried those dreams under layers of sarcasm and self-doubt, they never really died. Late at night, when the house was quiet, I'd take out my sketchbook again, or scribble down business ideas in the back of a notebook. I'd imagine a different version of me, someone who got to follow their own path without being laughed at. Someone who, maybe, could prove them wrong that it's funny, looking back now. The very things they mocked me for, the stubbornness, the crazy ideas, the refusal to just accept the mold they tried to shove me into, those are the things that eventually saved me. But at the time, all I felt was small, smaller than ever. And if I'm being honest, a part of me is still that 16-year-old kid with the sketchbook, waiting for someone, anyone, to say, I believe in you, when I finally got old enough to leave. I didn't so much step out of my family's shadow as I ran. Not literally, but in every other way. I knew if I stayed too close, I'd suffocate under their expectations, or worse, their laughter. So I packed up my life into 2 worn-out suitcases and told myself, this is it. This is where I start figuring out who I really am. Of course, that sounds more heroic than it really was. The truth? I had no plan, no blueprint, just this gnawing need to get away. My siblings had safety nets. They could mess up and my parents would cushion the fall. Me? I was the one they already assumed would fail, so no one was rushing to catch me. Maybe that's what made me stubborn enough to survive, that I worked the kind of jobs my family looked down on. Waiting tables, late-night shifts at a gas station, even cleaning offices after hours. Jobs they would have called beneath us. I can still smell the industrial cleaner on my hands, feel the sticky heat of the kitchen during Friday rushes. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. And every paycheck, no matter how small, felt like proof that I could stand on my own 2 feet. I remember one winter, walking home after a double shift. My coat was too thin, my shoes were soaked through with slush, and I was so tired I could barely lift my feet. But there was this weird sense of pride simmering underneath all the exhaustion. Because for the first time in my life, every single step I took was mine. Not controlled by their opinions. Not defined by their judgment. Just mine. Did I struggle? Absolutely. There were nights I ate instant noodles 3 days in a row. Nights I cried on the floor of my tiny apartment, staring at bills I didn't know how I'd pay. Nights when the silence was so loud I almost called home, but I didn't. I couldn't give them the satisfaction of hearing me say, you were right. I can't do this. And yet, in those struggles, I found pieces of myself I didn't know existed. I learned resilience. I learned that I could work until my body ached and still show up the next day. I learned that independence doesn't come in one big victory. It comes in 1,000 tiny, thankless choices you make just to keep moving forward. Sometimes, when I closed my eyes, I'd hear their voices again. The mockery, the doubts, the laughter. And instead of breaking me, I let it push me. I thought, fine, keep laughing. I'll show you. Even if it takes me years. Looking back now, I think those years of scraping by, of stumbling and learning the hard way, were the foundation for everything that came after. Because once you've proven to yourself that you can survive without anyone's approval, there's a kind of freedom in that. It wasn't easy. It wasn't pretty. But it was the beginning of me carving out my own path, one they couldn't take credit for, and one they couldn't laugh away at. No matter how far I tried to run, it always felt like my siblings' shadows stretched across the miles. Even when I was out there working, struggling, trying to stand on my own, I'd hear the updates. My mom would slip them into phone calls, almost like advertisements. Your brother just got promoted again. Your sister bought her first house. Isn't that wonderful? Always polished, always perfect. It wasn't just the updates. It was the way she said them, her voice lighting up, pride dripping from every word. And then, of course, came the inevitable follow-up. So, how's your little job going? That word, little, always landed like a dart. As if what I was doing didn't count. As if my entire existence was just filler in between the success stories she really wanted to talk about. I can still picture the family gatherings. Everyone seated around the dining table, my mom going on about my sister's new car, my dad nodding proudly about my brother's investments. Meanwhile, I'd be sitting there with a plastic smile, stirring the food on my plate, trying to pretend it didn't matter. But inside, it burned. It burned to be invisible in the very place that was supposed to feel like home. And what made it worse was the way my siblings carried themselves, like they knew they were the chosen ones. They'd pat me on the back, half smirking, and say things like, "Don't worry, not everyone's cut out for big things." Or, "You'll figure it out eventually." They weren't even cruel on purpose. That was the worst part. They genuinely believed they were being kind. But every kind word was a reminder that in their eyes, I was a project, a cautionary tale, the kid they used to measure how much better they were doing. There was one night that sticks with me. My sister's engagement party. The room was glowing, fairy lights strung up everywhere, champagne flowing. Everyone was dressed to the nines, hugging, laughing, celebrating. And then there was me, in a shirt I'd ironed 3 times to hide the fact that it was cheap. I remember, standing in the corner, watching my parents beam at her like she was the sun itself. My dad caught my eye across the room, smiled briefly, and then turned back to her. Just like that. A fleeting glance, gone in a second. That night, I went home and sat on the edge of my bed in the dark. I told myself I didn't care. You don't need their approval. You don't need their love. But the truth? I did. I wanted it so badly it ached. I wanted to know what it felt like to be someone's golden child, just once. But eventually, I realized something. I was never going to be their golden child. No matter what I did, no matter how hard I tried, that role was already taken. And once I stopped chasing it, once I let go of that impossible dream, I started to see my life differently. I wasn't polished. I wasn't perfect. But maybe, just maybe, I was building something of my own that mattered, even if no one else could see it. It had been months since I'd last spoken to my family. I'd gotten used to the silence, honestly. No check-ins. No, "How are you doing?" No invitations that weren't just pity-filled afterthoughts. And then, out of nowhere, my phone lit up one evening with a name I hadn't seen in a long time. Dad. I stared at it for a few seconds, debating whether to pick up. My first instinct was to let it ring out. I mean, why now? Why after all this time? But curiosity, and maybe some leftover piece of me that still craved their attention, made me swipe and answer. His voice was different. Softer. Too soft. He started with small talk, asking how I'd been, if I was eating well, if work was steady. Questions that, frankly, felt unnatural coming from him. The whole time, I kept waiting for the punchline, the subtle jab, the reason behind the call. And then it came. "There's something we need to discuss as a family," he said. Those words landed like a stone in my chest. We need. Not you need, not they need, but we. I hadn't been part of a we with them for years. My guard immediately shot up. Later that week, I found myself sitting at the old dining table again, the same one where I'd once been laughed at for whistling. The house smelled the same, faintly of lemon cleaner and overcooked roast. My siblings were there too, dressed in their usual polished way, smiles stretched too wide. The whole scene felt rehearsed, like a play where I was the unwilling audience. That's when they dropped it. The family business was in the middle of a massive deal. $60 million. I remember the number echoing in my head, like it didn't belong in the same air as me. And here's the kicker. For the deal to go through, they needed my signature. My signature. Mine. The black sheep, the odd one out, the joke of the family. Suddenly, I was the missing puzzle piece they couldn't move forward without. I wish I could say I felt triumphant in that moment. But honestly, what I felt first was suspicion. My mom kept touching my arm like we were close. My sister offered me wine with a syrupy smile. My brother cracked jokes like we were old friends. It was all so fake it made my skin crawl. Inside my head, a voice kept whispering, "They don't want you. They want what you can give them." And the worst part? They didn't even try to hide it for long. The moment I hesitated, the polite smiles faltered. My brother leaned forward, his tone dropping. "Look, this is important. We all need to benefit here. Don't make this difficult." That's when it hit me. They weren't here to reconcile. They weren't here to finally see me, finally value me. They were here because they were trapped, and I was their only way out. I left that night with their voices still ringing in my ears. Flattery, pressure, guilt. But under it all was the unmistakable truth. For the first time in my life, the black sheep had power. I don't think I've ever sat through a family meeting where every word felt like it carried a hidden blade. That night, though, that was exactly what it felt like. Every smile, every glance, every, "We're so glad you're here." It all carried weight. And when the real truth came out, it hit me like a punch to the chest. The deal wasn't just big. It was life-changing. $60 million. Dollars. A number so enormous it felt almost unreal, like something that belonged on TV, not in my family's living room. They laid it out for me piece by piece. The business, the land, the contracts, the legacy. And then, almost casually, my dad said, we need your signature to finalize everything. Without it, the deal falls apart." For a moment, I just sat there in silence, staring at the flickering chandelier light bouncing off the polished table. My brain scrambled, trying to process it. Out of all of them, the golden children, the pride and joy, the ones they built their entire legacy around. I was the one who held the key. I wanted to laugh. I really did. The irony was so sharp it almost made me dizzy. After years of being shoved aside, of being told I'd never amount to anything, here they were, looking at me like I was the savior. The black sheep suddenly crowned king. But underneath the rush of irony was something heavier. Suspicion. Why me? Why was my signature so important? Why hadn't they just moved forward without me before? The questions piled up like bricks, and the answers they offered felt too smooth, too rehearsed. They talked about joint ownership, about fair shares, about family unity. Words they'd never once cared to throw my way until now. And the way they acted, it was almost laughable. My mom, who used to barely notice if I was at the table, now kept refilling my glass. My sister leaned in with her soft voice, telling me how much she respected the way I'd made it on my own. My brother slapped my back and said, "We're all in this together." Together. The same brother who once called me the failure of the family now wanted to stand shoulder to shoulder. It was like watching actors stumble through a bad play. And the more they tried to sell it, the clearer it became. This wasn't about love or respect or even reconciliation. It was about desperation that I remember gripping the edge of my chair, nails digging into the wood, while my mind replayed every moment they'd made me feel small. Every laugh, every insult, every look of disappointment. And now, suddenly they were desperate for me to sign away a piece of myself for their gain. The black sheep had become the golden ticket. Walking out of that house later that night, the air felt colder, sharper. The streetlights blurred through my tired eyes, and I realized something that stopped me in my tracks. For once, they needed me more than I needed them. And let me tell you, that's a dangerous kind of realization, walking back into that house. Sitting at that table, being surrounded by all of them again. It was like reopening a wound I thought had already scarred over. Every corner of that place held memories, and none of them were kind. The smell of lemon cleaner in the hall, the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the corner, even the creak of the chair when I sat down, it all dragged me backward in time. That it's funny how memory works. One second I was listening to my dad drone on about the importance of family legacy, and the next I was 12 again, sitting at that same table, stomach knotted while everyone else laughed at my expense. I could almost hear it, my sister's mocking tone when she called me the weird one, my brother smirking when he said, "Don't be so sensitive, it's just a joke." Back then, I forced a smile. This time, my lips stayed pressed shut, but even in silence, the flashbacks kept flooding in. The Christmas morning where everyone unwrapped shiny new gifts while I opened a pair of socks. The graduation where my parents almost missed my name being called because they were too busy bragging about my brother's college acceptance. The family photo where my mom adjusted everyone's positions but told me, "Just stand at the end, it doesn't matter." Those moments don't leave you. They sit inside you, waiting until the right trigger cracks them wide open. And sitting at that table, pretending to be part of this sudden united front, I felt those old hurts pressing against my ribs. Every fake smile they gave me was like salt in the wound. My mom reaching for my hand, my sister saying, "We've missed you." My brother toasting to family. None of it was real. It was all performance, and I couldn't unsee it. Inside, I was screaming. Where was this love before? Where was this unity when I was breaking myself to earn it? Where were you when I was begging for just 1 ounce of respect? But of course, I didn't say it. I just sat there, letting them perform. Because now, I finally understood something I'd never dared to admit before. They would never change. They could smile, they could flatter, they could shower me with empty words, but The truth was the same. To them, I had never been good enough, until now, when $60 million hung in the balance. And even though I tried to keep my face blank, something shifted inside me that night. I stopped seeing them as the unshakable pillars of authority I'd always thought they were. For the first time, I saw them clearly, flawed, desperate, scrambling. And me, the black sheep, I was the one holding the leash. That realization didn't erase the pain. If anything, it made it sharper. Because no matter how much power I suddenly had, it couldn't undo the years of being treated like less. It couldn't erase the child in me who sat in the dark, wishing for their love. But it did give me one thing: clarity. And that clarity was going to shape what I did next. It's strange how quickly the air in a room can change. One minute they were all smiles, talking about family and unity like it was something we'd always shared, and the next, the cracks started to show. It happened the first time I didn't immediately agree to what they were asking. I set my fork down, leaned back in my chair, and just let the silence hang there. My mom's smile faltered, just slightly, but enough for me to notice. My sister's eyes flickered, nervous, impatient. And my brother? He leaned forward, voice dropping lower, sharper. Look, we don't have time for games. This deal has a deadline. Just sign the papers so we can all move forward. Just sign the papers. Like it was nothing. Like my name, my identity, was just ink on a page, and not the very thing they'd dismissed for years. That was the moment it hit me. They needed me, not the other way around. For once in my life, I wasn't the one begging for a seat at the table. They were the ones scrambling, softening their tones, choosing their words carefully, because if I walked away, everything crumbled. The shift in power was intoxicating. I'd be lying if I said it wasn't. Every time my brother raised his voice, I stayed quiet, calm, almost amused. Every time my mom tried to guilt-trip me with, "We're family, don't you want to see us all succeed?" I just looked at her, expressionless, and let her squirm in the silence. My sister kept overcompensating, complimenting my independence, my strength, things she'd never once said in her life. It was like watching a play where I'd suddenly been cast in the lead role, and they didn't know their lines anymore. Inside, I could feel something I hadn't felt in years: control, power, vindication, and yes, maybe a little revenge. Because with every panicked glance they exchanged, with every slip of frustration in their voices, I felt years of humiliation being chipped away. But here's the thing about power: it doesn't erase the hurt. Sitting there, watching them stumble over themselves to get me on their side, I should have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt conflicted. Because while a part of me relished the shift, another part of me, that kid who once begged for their approval, just wanted it all to be real. I wanted them to look at me and finally see me. Not the signature, not the leverage, me. And that's when I realized the cruelest part of all. Even with all the power in the world, I couldn't force them to give me what I'd always wanted: respect, love, belonging. That would never come with a pen stroke. So I sat there, letting them twist themselves into knots, all the while knowing something they didn't. The decision I was about to make wouldn't just affect their deal. It would change the story of who I was in this family, forever. The papers were spread out on the dining table, the same table where I'd once been a kid, too nervous to even raise my voice. This time, though, all eyes were on me. My siblings leaned forward like vultures. My mom's hand hovered just a little too close to mine. And my dad, well, he didn't say much. He just stared, like he could will me into obedience the same way he always had. The pen felt heavier than it should have. Just a cheap black ballpoint. But when I picked it up, it was like the weight of my entire childhood pressed down on my hand. Every insult, every smirk, every time I'd been overlooked, it was all there, hovering in the silence. My brother cleared his throat. "Come on. It's just a signature. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be." I almost laughed. Just a signature? That just was worth $60 million. That just was the reason they were suddenly treating me like a human being. That just was the only reason I mattered to them at all. My mom tried a different tactic. Her voice softened, her eyes glistened. "Sweetheart, you'll be part of something so much bigger. Don't you want to see us all succeed together?" Together. That word again. A word they'd never offered me before, now dangled like a prize I was supposed to chase. My chest tightened, but not in the way she intended. Because I knew the truth. The moment the ink dried, I'd go back to being the outsider. Invisible. Unwanted. I stared at the papers, and in my mind, the flashbacks came in waves. 10 years old, showing off my whistle, laughed into silence. 16, clutching my sketchbook while they mocked my dream. 20, scrubbing floors alone while they toasted my siblings' promotions. Every version of me that had been ignored or ridiculed was sitting at that table too, watching me, waiting for my choice. And for the first time in my life, I realized I didn't owe them anything. Not my time, not my energy, and certainly not my signature S.O. I put the pen down. Slowly, deliberately, the room went still. My sister's smile cracked, my brother's jaw clenched, my mom's hand froze midair. Not signing, I said. Calm, clear. My voice didn't shake the way it used to. The silence that followed was deafening. My dad finally spoke, low and sharp. Don't be foolish. You'll regret this. But I didn't. Not even a little. Because in that moment, I felt something I'd been chasing my whole life. Control over my own story. They could rage, they could threaten, they could call me selfish. It didn't matter. For once, I wasn't the black sheep desperately trying to fit in. I was just me. And me was enough that I walked away that night without looking back. No dramatic slamming of doors, no shouting match. Just me, standing up, sliding my chair back, and leaving them to stew in their own silence. For the first time in my life, I wasn't chasing their approval. I was choosing myself. The air outside felt different. Colder, sharper, but it was honest. I remember standing on the porch, taking a deep breath of night air, listening to the sound of crickets instead of the muffled voices behind the glass door. I didn't need to hear their arguments or their anger. I already knew what they'd say, that I was selfish, ungrateful, dramatic. The same words they'd thrown at me my whole life. But here's the thing, those words didn't stick anymore. Not after what I'd just done. In the days that followed, the calls and messages poured in. My brother's voice was angrier each time. My sister tried to guilt trip me with, "We'll lose everything without you." And my mom's messages swung between sweet and venomous. But I didn't answer. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood. Caring about them had always meant abandoning myself. And I wasn't willing to do that anymore. Flashback. I thought about the little kid version of me, sitting at that same table years ago, feeling invisible, wishing desperately for just one kind word. I imagined walking up to him now, putting a hand on his shoulder, and telling him, "You don't need their approval. One day, you'll walk away. And when you do, you'll finally be free." That thought alone felt like closure. Because here's the truth, closure doesn't always look like reconciliation. Sometimes, it's just letting go. Letting go of the fantasy that your family will suddenly see you, accept you, love you the way you've always wanted. Sometimes closure is deciding that their version of family isn't the only one that exists. That I built a new table after that night. Not literally, but in my life. A table with friends who felt like family, with people who celebrated my wins without jealousy, who stood by me without conditions. And every time we sat down together, laughing, eating, sharing stories, I realized this was the belonging I'd been searching for all along. Do I still think about them? Of course. Their blood, their history, but they're not my future. And when I look back now, I don't feel anger as much as I feel gratitude. Gratitude that I finally saw the truth. Gratitude that I didn't sign. Gratitude that I chose me. Because sometimes being the black sheep isn't a curse. Sometimes it's freedom.